Good morning. Today I want to think about the question, what is a presupposition? Now that's sort of a long word, not doesn't roll off the tongue exactly, and I don't know it's one we use very often outside of philosophy or theology. So what is a presupposition? And why use that term? In one way, this is like the word, maybe we use this more often, an assumption, right? Well, those are your presuppositions. Those are your assumptions that you're bringing to the argument. And the word presupposition, to sort of break it down, what's a supposition? A supposition is a belief. So a presupposition is a previous belief to your belief that must be true. It's like asking this question, what must be true for what you're saying to be true? So for example, if you say, God saves me, well, what does that presuppose? What other things have to be true for that to be true? And so in any situation, there are presuppositions that we bring to a discussion, and we don't always look at them. A lot of times we just go along in our conversations. One reason we might start to look at them is if we can't come to agreement and we don't know how to get further. Well, what happens is when we look at our conversation, we look at our arguments, it turns out we probably have competing presuppositions. We're bringing different presuppositions than the other person. And so then we need to back up and see how that's working. We can call this looking at the more basic. So there are less basic beliefs, which is to say not very basic beliefs, and there are more basic beliefs that are presupposed by those less basic beliefs. So in an argument, when we sort of get to one point and we don't agree, we can then say, well, we need to look at what's more basic than this. And that can go back a number of steps to what's most basic. So when we begin to get to our most basic presuppositions, we're getting into presuppositions about what is good. So if we're having an argument about morality or ethics, we're probably having disagreements or presupposing differences about what is good. Or what is real, more basic than what is good. What is good presupposes beliefs about the nature of things, about what is real. So more basic than what is good, we get back to what is real. And in a lot of arguments, we do have disagreements, disputes about what is real. What is the nature of things? I mean, think about some of the cultural arguments that are going on today about things like marriage or abortion or war or the environment. The persons in these arguments have different understandings of the nature of things. And so you'll be in an impasse. You won't get resolution about the actual disagreement until you're able to learn to think presuppositionally, back up and look, well, what is the nature of a person? What is the nature of life? What is the nature and purpose of marriage, its origin? What is the nature and purpose of the environment? These sorts of debates usually aren't the ones that get brought up. And so that's part of what we need to learn to do, thinking presuppositionally. Then behind that question, what is real? I went from what is good to what is real, is a question or a presupposition about knowledge. And a lot of times you'll see this in these kinds of debates. People bring competing views about how we know, competing views of authority. Our views of knowledge have to do with authority. What settles the matter? And so someone will say, well, so-and-so said this. That settles the matter for me. They'll quote a famous theologian, let's say, or they might quote, let's say they quote from Scripture and say, well, the Bible says it, so that settles it for me. But of course, in context where people quote the Bible, it's usually both sides agree, but they have different understandings. And so you have to get back to our presuppositions in that interpretation. Why do you understand the text that way when I understand it this other way? So knowledge, our presuppositions about how to know, and authority. How do we get back to those? And ultimately, we're getting back to our most basic belief. And beliefs are formed by putting concepts together. So, for example, the belief God saves me presupposes that God is real, that there is a God to save you. So you're putting together concepts, God and real. You're connecting them with is, saying God is real, God does exist. So our most basic concept gets back to existence in any argument. That would be true if we're having disputes about the desert wildlife. We'd get back to, well, is it real? In what sense is it real? And how do we understand the nature of things? So our most basic concept has to do with existence. And when we think about existence, we can think about it in two ways. There's eternal existence without beginning, and temporal existence with beginning. And whatever had a beginning was caused and brought into being by some other thing. And there's not an infinite regress of temporal things. I have another video about that you can look at. I'm going over that quickly here to get to eternal existence. What has always existed? One reason is that if there had been an infinite regress, then that regress had existed from eternity. So there's still something eternal that was without beginning. So eternal existence is our most basic concept. And our most basic presuppositions then have to do with eternal existence. Now notice that when we're talking about that, reason is not our most basic presupposition, because reason is not a belief. Reason, as the laws of thought, is presupposed in forming beliefs. That's true, but it's not itself a belief. We could have beliefs about reason, but reason, as the laws of thought, is that by which we form beliefs to understand things. In that sense, it's the highest authority, because any belief we have, including a belief like I only use the Bible, or the Bible's the highest authority, or this religious leader is my highest authority, or my experiences are my highest authority, any of those beliefs are formed by using reason, the law of identity, for example, to distinguish between things. Authority, highest authority, from not highest authority. So we're using reason to form our concept, eternal, distinguish it from not eternal, and then we're using reason to form beliefs about what's eternal. So in that sense, any beliefs presuppose reason, and you can't escape reason. You could fail to use it, but if you start to argue against reason, you're using reason to form your arguments against reason. So you have to ultimately flee to the non-cognitive, the non-rational, and stop having beliefs, stop having thoughts altogether. So reason is not a belief, but it's presupposed, and we use it to form our most basic concept. Presupposed because it's necessary to form any concept or any belief or any argument at all. But our most basic concept has to do with what is eternal. So our most basic beliefs have to do with what is eternal. And you can categorize the world systems in that way, looking at what they think is eternal. So for example, there are those who say all things are eternal. There was no creation. All is an eternal cycle of some kind. All is one. And that's supposed to be a very deep truth. When you come to some high level of contemplation, you realize all is one. And in contrast to that, not all is one. Some is eternal, God, and some things aren't eternal, the creation. And so you can see how the world systems are categorized into those and different ways in which they express that belief. It also helps us to know ourselves. What have I been going along thinking? Part of the purpose of thinking about presuppositions is bringing to light our unconsciously held assumptions, because we may not have been thinking presuppositionally at all and not realized the assumptions or presuppositions we're bringing to our arguments. And we might feel very passionately and very strongly about certain issues, say political issues, and we get in there and we argue, and we're not at all aware of our presuppositions. We don't know ourselves. We don't know the structure of our beliefs. And so, although we're passionate, we have zeal, we don't have knowledge of ourselves. And so, by learning to identify presuppositions, we're able to do that. Now, a brief aside, as a matter of history of philosophy, someone might notice when we talk about presuppositions, they might link this to something called the Transcendental Argument. There's a group, movement called the Presuppositionalists, and they would say, we use a transcendental argument. You must presuppose God to make sense of anything else. And this is a kind of argument traced often to Immanuel Kant, a philosopher, late 18th, early 19th century. And he gave a transcendental argument for morality, specifically this way. You must posit certain things for morality to be real, otherwise you lose morality, and specifically his view of morality that is called deontology, duty. And since in this life you're often not rewarded for duty, or the consequences of duty or failing to do duty aren't connected, the persons who are dutiful maybe aren't happy at all, you have to posit some things, for example, the afterlife, and God, and freedom. And you posit these things for morality to be true. Now, that form of transcendental argument, you can kind of understand how that works. I'm not suggesting that he got it right. That would be a whole different video. In fact, there might be some issues there. For example, it could be true that without an afterlife, there is no morality. If there is no future, there can be no lasting purpose. And so there can be no morality attached to a lasting purpose. All things end. But that doesn't follow that positing just any afterlife gives you morality. You have to look into the details of the afterlife that you're claiming to posit. But the structure is the presuppositional structure. These things must be true for this other thing you believe to be true. Now, to say that we ultimately have to posit God to get other things to be true, that could be the case. You have to look at the details of, well, what if all is one? can we have a distinction between good and evil anymore, or do we lose that? Must it be the case that only God is eternal to preserve the distinction between good and evil? But even then, you're still using reason. So notice that most basic is the use of reason, not say God. God might be most basic in the metaphysical structure to make sense of good and evil, but you're using reason to distinguish God from not God. And each step of that transcendental argument, you're using reason to say we must presuppose God to make sense of morality or anything else. Each of those words is using the law of identity to distinguish itself from what it isn't. God from not God. Presuppose from not presuppose. And the law of non-contradiction. If you don't presuppose God, you end up in a contradiction. And someone might say, well, who cares? I don't mind accepting contradictions. So you'd have to have a commitment to reason as the laws of thought, identity, non-contradiction, to then make any sense of any form of a transcendental argument. And there may be some unsound forms and some sound forms. So for that reason, I would call this rational presuppositionalism. It's making note of something which philosophers have noted from the beginning of philosophy. It's not Kantian per se. We have assumptions, and we have to get back and look at our assumptions, right? Socrates was doing this in the Apology when he's going around asking people about their assumptions. So we do have presuppositions. We need to learn how to identify them, getting back to our most basic presuppositions. I don't think, unfortunately, Socrates got back to that. His own views about what is eternal would need to be questioned as well. Not just assumptions about what is just or good. So we have noticed that in philosophy. It's one of the roles of philosophy, getting back to our assumptions, laying them bare, and then using reason to critically analyze them, as opposed to, for example, using intuition or empiricism or some other standard to analyze them. We're using reason to see, have you continued to make meaningful statements, or are you speaking nonsense? Have you abandoned the law of identity? You might say of the creation that it's eternal, and that is a contradiction, and so you've abandoned meaning. So rational presuppositionalism, with a brief aside to sort of the history of philosophy and the transcendental argument and presuppositionalism, one could be a presuppositionalist but end up being a kind of fideist, because one is positing something without showing the rational structure of it. And one might say something like this: you need God for rationality or logic. But then, of course, there's still this other sense in which you're using reason to make that argument, distinguishing God from not God and logic from not logic. So it becomes fideist until one recognizes one's assumptions and can explain them. Fideism being blind belief, blind assertion, and lots of views can do that. So God, we need God for morality, God for reason, God for logic, and all of those using reason as the laws of thought to form all of those arguments. So presuppositionalism can sort of pause at one point, become fideist, and we have to back up and say, no, ultimately the highest authority in forming beliefs is reason, the laws of thought. And we form beliefs in order to have meaning. So if we're contradicting ourselves, we've lost that meaning. We begin to speak nonsense. And so we call that rational presuppositionalism. So those two things, we've identified what is a presupposition, and in doing that, getting back to our most basic presupposition, and then secondly, using reason to critically examine our presuppositions for meaning, prior to if they're true or not. What do they even mean? And all of that within the context of knowing ourselves and knowing how arguments work. So as we go into an argument, we know our own presuppositions, we can identify the other person's presuppositions, and we can do that to work back to common ground to solve problems and settle disputes, which is within all this ultimate goal, coming to knowledge and agreement. So what is a presupposition? See you next time.